The Gospels are foundational to Christianity, but many doubt them, claiming that they're unreliable and written by men long after the eyewitnesses passed away. But when you look at the data, you find this position can only be held to if you ignore a plethora of evidence. Throughout this series, we have demonstrated the Gospels are incredibly reliable and most likely came from the eyewitnesses of Jesus, but there is even more data to cover. The Gospels surprisingly confirm each other in subtle ways, and together, they give us a reliable portrait of who Jesus is. This video is the final chapter in a series on gospel reliability. In the first video, we argued the Gospels are ancient Greco-Roman biographies, which means they fit a genre that aimed to preserve historical facts about a person. The Gospel authors were also quite conservative compared to other writers and didn't create drastic literary changes. We also surveyed the external data and found that we have unanimous agreement from church fathers that the Gospel authors are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There is no indication they were ever thought of as anonymous biographies. Then we demonstrated it would not have been difficult for the disciples to have reliable memories of Jesus' words and deeds for several decades after the resurrection. The culture of the time also fostered the development of strong memory. Within the Gospels, we see evidence of a reliable oral tradition that has a rhythmic nature, easy to retain for a long period of time. We also found evidence within Paul's letters that there was a gospel tradition that was already in existence and coheres to the same teachings that we find in our four Gospels. The evidence also indicates the Synoptic Gospels date to the late 50s and early 60s AD. Jesus likely taught in Greek occasionally, which means many of his original Greek sayings are preserved in the Gospels. New research suggests the naming pattern of the Gospels and Acts could not have come from fiction writers, but from authors who received reliable stories about Jesus. Finally, the internal evidence of each Gospel confirms the church tradition that the authors are Matthew and John, disciples of Jesus, and Mark and Luke, men who followed the apostles. With all this data in mind, we already have good reasons to trust the Gospels, but there is even more to cover. First, Paul Anderson makes an important observation. Many highlight differences between the Gospels to say they contradict, and then argue this is evidence not to trust them. We've addressed many of these in a series on alleged Bible contradictions, and have shown there are logical explanations for them. But Anderson notes we cannot ignore the high amount of agreement between them. He lists 31 places where all four Gospels agree on aspects of Jesus' ministry. Given the criteria of multiple attestation, this should support the reliability of these events of Jesus' ministry. He says, no fewer than 31 units of material are included in all four traditions, including John, within the mix despite its tradition often being presented in considerably different ways. Likewise, John has at least 44 memorable sayings in common with Mark, and as many as 13 possible contacts with the Q tradition, demonstrating the fact that while John's material is distinctive, it can by no means be considered unique. So the Gospels corroborate numerous aspects of Jesus' ministry, which would be expected if they were passing on reliable information about Jesus. As noted in more detail throughout this series, we see numerous indications they contain reliable traditions. Robert H. Stein notes Jesus taught in a way so his teachings would be easy to memorize and retain for a long period of time. He utilized overstatements, hyperbole, puns, similes, metaphors, proverbs, riddles, paradoxes, a fortiori, irony, questions, poetry, and parables. Teaching in this manner makes your sayings easy to remember. For example, riddles and paradoxes require one to think to figure out the answer, and meditating on them commits them to memory. Hyperbole and overstatements come with a bit of shock value, which makes them stick out in your mind. Metaphors create pictures in our minds that help us memorize the teaching. Jesus also taught in a poetic and rhythmic nature through parallelism. Stein demonstrates that we see evidence of synonymous, antithetical, climactic, and chiasmic parallelism in Jesus' teachings. David Ahn notes that 80% of the synoptic material has a poetic form of some sort. Speaking in a rhythmic nature allows one to memorize your teachings easier. Presented in such a form, one could retain thousands of lines of text this way, as David Carr said. Youth such as my teenage daughter and her peers, like their ancient counterparts, could recite and sing hundreds, if not thousands, of lines of text. In her case, songs she has listened to repeatedly on her portable CD player, and whose lyrics she has often learned from printed CD inserts. Such youths are socialized into broader generational groups and subgroups by having such contents, rhythms, and musical idioms written on their hearts. Any community or early educational institution aiming to offer a different sort of formation must reckon with the immense power of joined music and text, along with image, to shape the hearts of the young and old. It is as if music and poetry, or poeticized canted prose, is the indelible marker for writing words on the heart. So much of what Jesus taught was likely memorized with ease. Additionally, he taught using a unique method of the time, through parables. Parables existed before Jesus, but no one created so many as part of their teaching method before him. About 35% of the material in the Synoptics is in the form of a parable. Stein notes scholars are confident the parables go back to the historical Jesus. One of the reasons is the dissimilarity of them. We don't have a precedent among Jews in the Second Temple period, or prior, where it was common for a rabbi to use parables to such a high degree. We also don't see early church fathers creating parables after this. In other words, we have no reason to believe the early church created parables as a standard practice and then merely projected them back onto Jesus. Jesus' teachings are dissimilar to both, so they likely originated with him and are not something one would make up by appealing to the cultural norm. It seems more likely Mark merely passed on the parables of Jesus, rather than him being the originator of them. Then later authors Matthew and Luke invented more, and then the practice completely ceased in the early church. In other words, it is more likely the parables in the Gospels originated with Jesus, rather than being made up by 3 authors later on, as part of some obscure church practice, and then no one else continued this custom. But the other important point to remember is parables are easy to memorize, because stories are retained well in the human mind. Most people today could probably give a rough outline of many of the parables of Jesus without even trying. No matter how we look at it, we have every reason to believe the teachings of Jesus were easy to memorize and retain. Thus, Robert Stein concludes, one can also conclude that Jesus must have spent time in organizing his teachings and preparing its form, for unless we assume that this poetic parallelism simply popped into his mind on the spur of the moment, we must conclude that Jesus carefully prepared for his classes. Another conclusion that can be drawn from Jesus' use of parallelism is that he no doubt used such forms in order to help his listeners remember more easily what he taught. The extent to which Jesus taught as a rabbi is much debated, but it is clear from his use of various kinds of parallelism that he did place his teachings in a form that would be easy to memorize. By placing his message in such poetic form, Jesus demonstrated that his listeners were to preserve and retain his teachings in their minds, as well as in their hearts. In other words, when we read the Gospels, there is no reason to doubt we have the words of Jesus, as he gave them throughout the 3 years he taught. It is not a question of if his disciples were able to memorize what he taught, but how much they could have memorized. Given the rhythmic nature of Jesus' teachings, we would expect a drastic amount. This also supports the view the Gospel authors were preserving accurate information. Fiction writers would not have felt the need to make their teachings that they put on the lips of Jesus match the way a rabbi would speak if he was trying to get his disciples to commit his words to memory. They could simply have written what they wanted, without worrying if it matched a form that would be easy to memorize if one was hearing it verbally. But if the Gospels preserve the actual teachings of Jesus, who taught in a memorizing way, this is how we would expect the teachings of the Gospels to look. Thus, we have good reasons to believe the teachings of the Gospels go back to the historical Jesus. Adding to this, Luke Vandeweghe and Jason Wilson's research has effectively demonstrated the distribution of names in the Gospels matches with the pattern of names we find in first century Judea. Fiction writers could not obtain this accurate pattern of names that matches the ratio of popular to least popular names from the first century. But the Gospel authors did with incredibly high accuracy. Not only do the sayings of Jesus reflect the way a Jewish rabbi would teach, but the names in the stories surrounding Jesus accurately reflect the names of first century Judea. As Richard Bauckham says, the Gospel texts are much closer to the form in which the eyewitnesses told their stories, or passed on their traditions, than is commonly envisaged in current scholarship. This is what gives the Gospels their character as testimony. They embody the testimony of the eyewitnesses, not of course without editing and interpretation, but in a way that is substantially faithful to how the eyewitnesses themselves told it, since the evangelists were more or less direct contact with eyewitnesses, not removed from them by a long process of anonymous transmission of the traditions. Adding to this, the Gospels also confirm each other in unexpected ways, which are called undesigned coincidences. This is an older argument for Gospel reliability that has recently resurfaced. They are defined as a notable connection between two or more accounts, or texts, that doesn't seem to have been planned by the person or people giving the accounts. Despite their apparent independence, the items fit together like pieces of puzzles. To give an example, Luke Vandeweghe highlights different accounts in the Anne Frank narratives from the Holocaust. Hannah Elizabeth Pick Goslar recalls speaking to Anne Frank in Bergen-Belsen and throwing Red Cross packages to her on occasion. Rachel von Amaragen Frank Fordor stated Anne and Margot would go to the fence line regularly, believing that Anne knew someone on the other side in the free camp, which is where Hannah Elizabeth Pick Goslar stayed. Both of these statements cohere together to give us a fuller picture of what Anne Frank was doing. Neither statement is trying to explain the other, but they work together like puzzle pieces to give us a complete picture. Throughout the Gospels, we find numerous places where one author explains another without trying. These types of coincidences make more sense on the theory the Gospels are reporting history and not inventing fiction. It is important to note, undesigned coincidences can only strengthen the reliability of the Gospels. Some have placed too much emphasis on them in attempting to demonstrate the Bible is true. We believe they are useful, but only as part of a cumulative case for Gospel reliability. The argument also only works as a cumulative case of several instances. One may find a few undesigned coincidences in fictional works, like how sometimes random puzzle pieces fit together, even when they're not supposed to. But when one finds multiple pieces that fit together, it makes more sense they are supposed to fit together, to present a realistic picture of the past. So we are merely arguing a cumulative case of undesigned coincidences makes more sense on the theory the Gospels are reporting history, rather than inventing fiction. As the scholar Craig Keener said, the argument from undesigned coincidences is one that continues to prove effective, as already noted, in interviewing witnesses. Here then is a valuable and accessible approach for recognizing significant historical information in the Gospels. A good place to start is something we find in Luke and John. Luke tells us that at the Last Supper, a dispute arose among them, as to which of them was to be regarded as the greatest. Jesus ends the dispute by saying, "Let the greatest among you become as the youngest, and the leader as one who serves. For who is the greater, one who reclines at table, or one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at table? But I am among you as the one who serves." Jesus doesn't do any serving in this passage. He could be referring to past instances where he spent time healing others. But John's account of the Last Supper adds context to make better sense of this, because he tells us Jesus dressed as a servant and washed the feet of the disciples. This would explain why Jesus uttered what he said in Luke. But also, Luke explains something in John, because John doesn't tell us why Jesus washed the disciples' feet. Luke adds that there was a dispute, which explains why John reports that Jesus felt the need to wash the feet of the disciples to demonstrate how to lead. Neither seems to be trying to explain away the difficulty in the other. For example, since John was written after Luke, and if John was bothered by how Luke worded this, he would have written what Luke recorded, and then added that Jesus washed the disciples' feet. Instead, both accounts seem to be recounting the story and adding details that fit together like puzzle pieces. So John explains Luke, and Luke explains John. This is often how undesigned coincidences work. An author provides details in one account that adds context to another account, allowing the story to make more sense. Both accounts in Luke and John of the Last Supper can work independently, but when combined, the whole story sounds more plausible. Some undesigned coincidences go even further, though, by explaining something that doesn't make sense in another gospel. For example, in Luke, when Jesus is before Pilate, Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus replies, "You have said so." Then Pilate says to the crowds, "I find no guilt in this man." But didn't Jesus just admit to the charge? Why would Pilate find no guilt with him? So something is either wrong or missing. Luckily, John adds context. Pilate brings Jesus in and asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus replies, "My kingdom is not of this world." So his kingdom is a spiritual kingdom, which would not be a threat to Caesar, and why Pilate can find no guilt in him. This shows us nothing Luke says is incorrect, but John gives the context for it to make sense. But not only does John add context for Luke, Luke adds context for John, because John doesn't give us the accusation from the Jews that Jesus claimed to be a king, which explains why Pilate would even ask Jesus if he was the king of the Jews. So both accounts support each other. Luke gives us the accusation, and John gives us the answer from Jesus as to why he was innocent, and neither seems to be trying to fill in details to explain the other. So these undesigned coincidences work together so the story makes sense. The next example is found in John 18. Right before his arrest, Jesus says, "Put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?" But nowhere in John do we see him tell us what this refers to. But in Mark, we see Jesus praying to the Father and say, "Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me." Earlier in Mark, we see Jesus tell us this cup refers to his mission to give his life as a ransom for many. Thus, Mark explains this line in John. Of course, both accounts could work fine independently, but together, we see the story now makes more sense. Likewise, we can also ask why the four Gospels report that Peter had a sword, especially if Jesus was not planning any violence. Luke alone supplies the answer, by noting that Jesus commanded it so the scriptures could be fulfilled. So Luke explains this for the other three. Following this incident, we see the trial scene where Jesus says, "If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews." But prior to this, we see Peter cut off the ear of the high priest's servant. Why would Jesus make such a claim if Malchus had just been attacked? Luke supplies the answer. Jesus healed his ear, removing the evidence of the attack. John does not report that the ear was healed, so Luke explains an issue in John. Matthew recounts a conversation between Herod and his servants. This event is in Mark, but Matthew adds the fact that Herod was speaking to his servants. Of course, the obvious question is, how would Matthew have known that Herod spoke to his servants? Luke supplies an answer without trying. In chapter 8, he lists some women followers of Jesus and says one of them was the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager. This coincidentally creates an explanation for how Matthew could have been aware of what took place in Herod's house. They had inside informants. Matthew's change to Mark shows us he has independent information to enhance Mark's story, and so Luke explains something in Matthew. Luke explains another aspect in Matthew. We read that Jesus said, "Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes." The issue is Matthew never explicitly tells us of mighty works done in Bethsaida. However, in Luke we read the feeding of the 5,000 occurred by the city of Bethsaida. Plus, Mark reports that Jesus healed a blind man when he came to Bethsaida. So in Matthew, Jesus can say that mighty works were done for them because a blind man was healed there and the feeding of the 5,000 occurred in that region. In Mark, the healing of the blind man happens after the feeding of the 5,000. He tells the man after to not even enter Bethsaida, apparently showing how serious Jesus was about the woes. But Mark makes no mention of the woes, and just leaves the fact that Jesus took the man out of the town to heal him and didn't allow him to return as an unexplained illusion. Thus Luke and Mark explain the saying in Matthew, and Matthew's saying explains something in Mark. John also doesn't tell us the feeding of the 5,000 happened in Bethsaida, but in his account, Jesus asks Philip where they could buy bread for the people. Earlier in John, we see that Philip was from Bethsaida. So Luke also explains the existence of this question in John. Jesus asked Philip because he was from the region, which John doesn't connect in the actual passage of the feeding of the 5,000. Another aspect of this miracle is that Mark specifically mentions that Jesus commanded the people to sit down on green grass. This is odd because the grass isn't often green in the land of Israel. But Peter J. Williams notes, it is green in the spring after the winter rains fall. John accounts for why Mark says the grass was green, because he says this miracle occurred when the Passover was at hand. Williams also notes that John 6:9 informs us that the loaves Jesus multiplied were barley loaves, which aligns with this immediately following the barley harvest which occurred around Passover. Mark 6 also says many people were coming and going, but he doesn't say why. If pilgrims were heading to or from Jerusalem for Passover, this would explain the line in Mark. So John explains these details in Mark and doesn't appear to be doing so on purpose, since the details are not in view in his gospel. John does this in one other place. A question that arises is, how did the evangelists know there were about 5,000 men for this miracle? How did they single out the men and count them? Mark says they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties, which would have made them easier to count. But John doesn't mention this detail, but adds that it was specifically the men who sat down. So John explains this detail in Mark, which in turn explains how the other gospel authors knew the rough estimate of men. In Mark and Matthew, Jesus is accused of claiming he would destroy the temple and in 3 days build another. They never explain where this accusation came from, but in John's gospel, we see early in Jesus' ministry, he said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up," in reference to his body. It should be noted John doesn't recount this incident to explain the later accusation we find in Matthew and Mark, which seem to be a garbled version of what Jesus said. Of course, Matthew and Mark do function fine without the context from John, but together they make the whole story more realistic. John's account gives context as to why Jesus would be accused of such a crime. Alan Chappell adds it in Mark 3:22, scribes come from Jerusalem to Galilee to denounce Jesus. No reason is given for their need to travel to Galilee to attack a rabbi who they had no interaction with in Mark so far. But Chappell notes this would make sense if Jesus had already gone to Jerusalem and caused trouble at the temple, which we see takes place before this in John's Gospel. John doesn't recount the events we read about in Mark, and John doesn't write about the temple cleansing to offer an explanation to account for this. Thus, John explains this detail in Mark without trying to. In the Synoptics, Jesus often doesn't want people to know he's the Messiah, but no reason is given for this. Craig Blomberg notes John 6 provides the answer, when a group comes and tries to forcibly make him king. This would explain why Jesus didn't want a lot of people to know that he was the Messiah. Blomberg says, John 6:15 confirms what commentators have often suspected, that at least part of the answer is because of Jewish hopes for a political or military Messiah. But only John explicitly describes how after the feeding of the 5,000, the crowds intended to come and make him king by force. Thus, John explains the reason for the messianic secret in the Synoptics. Individually, each of these undesigned coincidences would not amount to much, but when combined, they form a strong cumulative case. The Gospels report history. If all we had to go on were 4 or 5, that would not be enough to use for gospel reliability. But given the amount we have, we can see undesigned coincidences show the Gospels confirm each other in subtle ways and form a web of connectivity. This is far more likely on the theory the Gospels are reporting history, rather than writing fiction. Fictional authors do not create a web of interconnectivity that makes the whole story more realistic. Now, some object and argue undesigned coincidences cannot prove the truth of the stories or that the miracles actually occurred, and we must agree. No one should argue undesigned coincidences prove the feeding of the 5,000 occurred. The philosopher Lydia McGrew says in her book on this topic, "I do not want to be misconstrued as saying something quite so simple as, we can see from undesigned coincidences that the Gospels are historically reliable. Therefore, they are reliable when they recount miracles, as well as when they give non-miraculous facts. Therefore, probably, all these miracles happened." On the other hand, I do not want to concede an artificial separation between the miraculous claims in the Gospels and the non-miraculous ones, as though the former were prima facie false or dubious. I grant that claims of miracles are legitimately held to a higher evidential standard than non-miraculous claims for many reasons. If nothing else, there are many ways for honest people to be mistaken about some miracles, especially healing miracles. Mere credulity is not a posture I recommend. It is, however, noteworthy that the internal marks of accuracy in the Gospels cut right across the miraculous, non-miraculous divide. If the Gospels are indeed truthful memoirs from those close to the facts, including those who had opportunity to interview the disciples themselves, then they represent not late traditions or storytelling. Rather, they represent what the alleged eyewitnesses themselves claimed, for which they suffered severe early persecution. This point is presumably why propositions about the dating and authorship of the Gospels are treated by critical scholars as controversial. For if they are early and reliable memoirs of the life and death of Jesus, if they show us what the disciples themselves claimed about his resurrection, if they make it clear that these accounts came from people in a position to know, and if the disciples were willing to face death for their testimony, this pulls the rug out from under a gentle-sounding but skeptical theory that nobody told a lie exactly, but that the miraculous claims about Jesus grew up among credulous people telling each other stories. One is instead forced to ask whether the disciples lied about these matters, and if so, why they would do such a thing. Even when the undesigned coincidences among the Gospels do not directly support a miracle, they support the argument for their earliness and origins. So undesigned coincidences should only be used to support the reliability and earliness of the accounts, not that they necessarily are true. One must use an historical case for the resurrection of Jesus to get to that step, in which the reliability of the Gospels inevitably aids. And when we survey many undesigned coincidences, we can conclude they support the overall reliability of the Gospels. This is on top of all the other data that confirms the reliability of the Gospels. When we go through the evidence piece by piece, there is no reason to deny the conclusion that the Gospels are reliable accounts of who Jesus is. The reasonable conclusion to draw from this data is that when we read the Gospels, we are reading history, not mythology. The Gospels are, in fact, eyewitness accounts.